This is The Quiet End, and tonight I'll tell you a story titled Roots of the Forgotten. Let's begin. Eliza adjusted her scarf against the biting wind as she stepped off the rickety bus, its engine coughing as it lurched away down the dirt road. Before her stood Greystone Hollow, a village that seemed forgotten by time, and perhaps by the world itself. The air held a damp, earthy scent, heavy with the kind of stillness that made her instinctively glance over her shoulder. Here, the silence wasn't sanctuary. It was suffocating. The houses leaned against one another, weather-worn and wrapped in crawling vines so thick they threatened to consume the structures entirely. The tendrils pulsed faintly, their surface slick and dark as though veined with something that wasn't natural. She could swear they were breathing, the motion subtle, yet unnervingly deliberate. Villagers shuffled past her without meeting her gaze, their faces pale and drawn. Hollow eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, but it felt deeper, more ingrained. One man, his hands trembling, dropped a bundle of firewood at her feet. He muttered an apology, his voice raw and cracked, before scurrying away like someone chased by shadows. Eliza gathered her courage and approached a woman selling jars of honey at a crooked stall. "Excuse me," she began, forcing a smile. "I'm looking into the plant growth here for an article." The woman's face hardened, her lips thinning into a taut line. She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced at the vines creeping along the ground like silent predators. "You shouldn't have come," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what it wants." The words hung heavy in the air, sending a chill crawling up Eliza's spine. She wanted to ask more, but the woman turned abruptly and hurried away, leaving her alone with questions, and with the unsettling realization that the vines had somehow grown closer, their tendrils stretching toward her feet as if drawn by her presence. Eliza's boots sank into the damp soil as she ventured beyond the village's edge, her curiosity outweighing the unease gnawing at her thoughts. The outskirts of Greystone Hollow were tangled with ancient trees whose gnarled roots clawed at the earth. Shadowed by overgrowth, she stumbled upon the first stone. It was half-buried and slick with moss, the vine curling around its edges as if cradling it protectively. She crouched, brushing away leaves and dirt to reveal carved symbols, crude but unnervingly deliberate. Human figures twisted grotesquely, their limbs melding into spiraling vines, their mouths frozen in silent screams. A chill swept over her as she traced one elongated arm, the fingers dissolving into thorny tendrils. Her hands trembled as she uncovered more stones scattered among the roots. Each told a similar story, bodies transforming, faces contorted in agony or something worse, acceptance. The carvings didn't feel like art or mythology, they felt like warnings. She snapped photographs hastily, her heart pounding in her ears as a faint rustling started from somewhere nearby. Night came swiftly, swallowing the land in oppressive darkness. The village offered no comfort. Its lanterns burned dim and the streets lay abandoned. Eliza returned to her rented room, but the unease stayed with her. She couldn't shake the oppressive feeling that something was watching, waiting. As she lay sleepless on the creaking bed, whispers began. They came from the ground beneath her. Faint at first, but growing louder, a chorus of fragmented voices that seemed to slip through the cracks in reality. "The roots remember," they whispered, each word dragging across her mind like claws. "Secrets are gifts, if you listen." Eliza bolted upright, her breath caught in her throat. She pressed her ear to the floor, against every instinct screaming at her to stop. The whispers twisted into a melody, haunting yet seductive, like promises too tempting for mortals to resist. She pulled away, clutching the sheets as the vines outside her window began to move, shifting ever so slightly, as though they were preparing to speak. The morning brought no reprieve from the weight in Eliza's chest. She returned to the village square, desperate for answers, but the villagers' expressions were masks of unease. Only an elderly woman, her eyes clouded but sharp with memory, dared to speak. "They've taken many," the woman murmured, her voice rasping like dry leaves. She leaned closer, her breath reeking of something earthy. "Not just the travelers like you, our own, mothers, fathers, children." Eliza's stomach tightened. "Children?" she pressed, her voice trembling. The woman nodded gravely. The last was Sarah, only 7 summers old, she said. She vanished a year ago. No one will speak of her now. They fear. It'll hear. Curiosity gnawed at her. Eliza convinced the woman to take her to the child's abandoned home. The house was small, its windows darkened by the vines that strangled its walls. Inside there was a stillness that seemed unnatural, as though time had stopped the moment Sarah had disappeared. The child's room was worse. The air felt heavier as Eliza pushed open the door. The vines had overtaken every surface, curling around the bedposts, weaving through the dresser drawers and swallowing the walls whole. But it was the doll that made her breath hitch. It sat in the corner, half buried in the roots. Its porcelain face had warped, the once smooth features now strangely human-like, almost lifelike. Its eyes, no longer glass, seemed to follow her as she stepped closer. The roots coiled around its limbs, as though they had grown into it, fusing the inanimate with the organic. Eliza reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the doll. It was warm. A pulse, faint but unmistakable, throbbed through the vines entwined with its body. She yanked her hand back, her heart pounding in her ears. Behind her, the woman gasped. "You shouldn't have touched it," she whispered, her voice quaking. Before Eliza could reply, the woman darted out of the house, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. Eliza looked back at the doll. Its lips, once painted in a frozen smile, now seemed to curl ever so slightly, as though amused. The night dragged Eliza into a world she couldn't escape. Her dreams were vivid, oppressive. She wandered through an endless forest, its trees impossibly tall, their roots twisting skyward like serpents reaching for the heavens. The air was heavy, humming with an ancient rhythm that vibrated deep within her chest. She felt dwarfed, insignificant beneath the towering roots that seemed to pulsate, alive and watching. Voices echoed through the dreamscape, indistinct at first, but slowly sharpening into words she could almost understand. They spoke of things buried and forgotten, of secrets older than mankind. "The roots remember," they whispered, a phrase she had heard before. But now it was inside her, crawling under her skin. Eliza jolted awake, her breath ragged and her forehead damp with sweat. But the nightmare hadn't fully released her. The whispers lingered, faint yet persistent, like distant echoes trapped within her mind. Then she saw it, a thin vine curled around her wrist, its surface slick and faintly pulsating. She froze, her pulse racing as she stared at the innocuous yet deeply unsettling intrusion. The vine was warm, unnervingly so, as though it shared her own body heat. Her first instinct was to pull it off, but as her fingers gripped it, a sharp pain shot through her arm, almost as if the vine resisted her touch. Eliza stumbled out of bed, clutching her wrist. Her thoughts felt invaded, muddled with words and sensations that weren't hers. Images flashed in her mind, faces merging with roots, forests swallowing villages whole, and a presence vast and incomprehensible, watching her from the depths of the earth. She leaned against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "This isn't real," she muttered to herself, but the whispers rose in response, louder now, dissonant and demanding. "Isn't it?" they seemed to ask, their tone teasing. She slammed her palm against the wall, but the voices didn't fade. Instead, they burrowed deeper, weaving through her thoughts like the vines that had overtaken the village. Eliza stared at her wrist again. The vine had retracted slightly, as if retreating into her skin. It left no mark but an undeniable presence, one she couldn't shake. She wasn't sure anymore if what she was seeing or feeling was real, and worse, she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Eliza pressed deeper into the woods, her mind a haze of dread and compulsion. The whispers had grown quieter, but they hadn't stopped. They guided her steps now, their tone no longer pleading but insistent, as though the forest itself willed her onward. She didn't know how long she walked before she stumbled upon the clearing. It was hidden, shrouded by thorny brambles and towering trees that bent unnaturally inward, shielding its secrets from the sky. The air here was heavy, humid, and laced with a metallic tang that stuck to the back of her throat. At the clearing's center lay the root. Massive and grotesque, it pulsed with a rhythmic thrum that she could feel in her chest. Its surface was dark, slick, and veined with red and green, as though it carried the lifeblood of something ancient and alive. The ground around it was littered with remnants of rituals long past. Candles melted into unrecognizable mounds, bones half buried in the soil, and symbols carved so deeply into the earth that they seemed to bleed shadows. Eliza's breath caught as she stepped closer. She couldn't help herself. The root wasn't just alive, it was aware. She felt it, a deep, intrusive pull at the edges of her mind. It whispered not in words but in sensations, in glimpses of things too vast and horrifying to comprehend fully. Memories that weren't hers flickered in her thoughts. Villagers kneeling in worship, their faces streaked with tears and dirt, hands reaching out desperately as the vines consumed them. And beneath it all, the root's hunger, endless and insatiable. Her legs trembled, but she couldn't stop moving forward. The air grew warmer, almost oppressive, as though the clearing itself was alive and breathing. She reached the edge of the root, her hands trembling as she extended them involuntarily toward its surface. Then she saw it, a face, faint but unmistakable, pressed against the root's slick exterior, its features distorted as though trapped within. The eyes stared back at her, wide and pleading, but what chilled her most was that the face didn't look ancient. It was fresh, new. A wave of nausea rolled over her, and she stumbled back, her chest heaving. But the root throbbed harder, its pull intensifying. "Stay," it seemed to say, though it never spoke. She scrambled out of the clearing, her heart hammering, the whispers following her as she fled. But even as she escaped its reach, she knew the root wasn't done with her. It had touched her mind, and it wouldn't let go. Eliza sat stiffly in Marek's crumbling kitchen, the dim light of a single oil lamp casting flickering shadows across the walls. The elderly man's hands trembled as he poured her tea, though his eyes were steady and sharp, like someone who had seen far too much, yet survived to tell it. She hadn't meant to confide in him, but after her escape from the clearing, her desperation had spilled out in a torrent of words. To her surprise, he didn't mock her or dismiss her fears. Instead, he sighed, as though bracing himself to reopen an ancient wound. "You've felt it," Marek said finally, his voice low but steady. "The pull, the whispers, it's because it knows you now. It's seen you." Eliza leaned forward, her voice a strained whisper. "What is it? That thing in the woods? The vines? Why are they everywhere? What's happening here?" Marek sat back, his gaze distant, as though peering through the veil of memory. "It's not a plant," he said softly, "not as you'd think of one. The vines, the roots, they're just parts of it, tendrils of something far greater, far older." He paused, his breath hitching before continuing. "The elders called it the verdant one, but it's older than names, older than gods. It was here before us, before anything human walked the earth. It doesn't live like we do. It grows, spreads, and feeds, not on flesh but on minds, on thoughts and memories. It pulls them into itself, merges them, and they become part of it. A collective consciousness, eternal and ever-expanding." Eliza felt a chill crawl up her spine. "The faces in the root," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Are they people?" Marek nodded grimly. "They were. Villagers, travelers, anyone unlucky enough to fall under its influence. That's how it survives. It doesn't kill, not exactly. It takes, and once it takes you, there's no coming back. You're no longer you. You're part of it." Eliza's throat tightened, her mind reeling. "Why doesn't anyone fight it? Why do you stay here knowing this?" Marek's expression darkened. "We can't leave. The vines, they've rooted in us too. Not like you've seen, not outwardly, but they're there inside. The ones who try to escape, they wither, their minds unraveling until there's nothing left. We're bound to it, just as this village is bound to the soil. For generations, we've served it, fed it, and in return it lets us live." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "But it's growing restless. It's hungry, and it's reaching out further. That's why you're here. It called to you, just like it's called to so many others." Eliza's hand instinctively went to her wrist, where the vine had curled around her. She hadn't told Marek about that, but his words made her feel exposed, as though the root's gaze was upon her even now. "Leave if you can," he said, though there was little hope in his voice. "But know this, it doesn't forget. Once it's touched you, there's no escaping its grasp." Eliza ran. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder, deeper into the forest, away from the cursed village and the suffocating truths Marek had revealed. The path ahead was narrow, flanked by trees whose gnarled branches reached for her like skeletal hands. Every step felt heavier, as though the earth itself sought to hold her back. Then it began. First, a subtle rustle, then the insidious slither of the vine. It moved faster than she thought possible, snaking along the ground and climbing the trees, weaving a living barrier in her path. She turned sharply, veering toward another trail, but it was futile. The vine was everywhere, a relentless tide of green and black that surged toward her with purpose. It caught her ankle first, yanking her to the ground. She screamed, clawing at the dirt, but more tendrils coiled around her legs, her arms, pulling her down. The texture of the vine was slick and warm, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the frantic beat of her heart. She thrashed, kicking wildly, but it tightened, wrapping around her neck, her throat constricting as panic set in. The whispers erupted in her mind, louder than ever, but now they weren't whispers. They were screams, a cacophony of voices layered atop one another, drowning out her thoughts. "Join us," they howled. "Become one. There is no pain here, no fear, only unity, only forever." Eliza's vision blurred as the vine pulled her closer to the ground, her face scraping against the damp soil. Then the visions came. Sharp and vivid, they pierced through her mind like shards of glass. She saw them, countless others before her, their faces twisted in terror as the vines consumed them. She saw their souls, or what remained of them, trapped within the root, their features distorted, their voices now part of the endless screaming chorus. And then she saw herself, her own face, serene and empty, pressed against the root's slick surface like the others she had seen before. She tried to shake the image away, but it clung to her, a cruel glimpse of inevitability. "No," she choked, her voice barely audible as she fought against the tightening grip. But the vine didn't relent. It pulled her closer, its warmth creeping into her skin, her veins, her very being. The forest around her seemed to fade, the world narrowing to the sound of her own gasps and the relentless alien screams in her mind. Eliza's screams faltered as the vine tightened its grip, its warmth seeping deeper into her flesh. Her thoughts, once frantic and defiant, began to slow, diffusing like ink in water. The voices in her head shifted, their chaos softening into a painful clarity. They weren't strangers, they were the others, the villagers, the travelers, the lost souls, all merged, all part of something far greater than themselves. Her body felt heavy, distant, as though it no longer belonged to her. She watched in detached horror as her fingers darkened, their flesh splitting to reveal fibrous threads beneath. They stretched outward, curling into the soil like roots searching for sustenance. Her arms followed, her legs, her torso, all dissolving, all transforming. Yet there was no pain, only the overwhelming pressure of the collective, pushing its way into every corner of her mind. The memories of others flooded her, a mother's grief, a child's laughter, a man's final scream as the vines claimed him. They became her memories, indistinguishable from her own. Her identity unraveled, slipping into the vast, ancient expanse of the Verdant One. The village grew still. The vines retreated into the earth, satisfied, leaving behind no trace of Eliza or her struggle. Houses sagged under their weight, hollow and silent, as though holding their breath. The villagers, bound to the entity's will, returned to their routines, their eyes blank, their movements mechanical. But the root beneath the earth stirred. It pulsed with new energy, new life, as Eliza's essence merged fully into its depths. The Verdant One was awake again, its hunger momentarily sated but never quenched. The vines, now stronger, stretched further into the forest, creeping toward unseen horizons, seeking new minds, new bodies to claim. In time, humanity would forget this place, as it always did. The village would fade from maps, its name lost to memory. But the roots would remain, spreading, waiting. And beneath the earth, the ancient entity would slumber, dreaming of a world it could call its own. Forever. So tell me, dear listener, when you hear the rustle beneath your feet, are they just roots in the soil, or roots already winding through you? Subscribe for more chilling tales and hit the bell to stay in the dark. See you at the next Quiet End.